Kambhampati from University of Reading and Supriya Garikipati from University of Liverpool. Your research, Leading the Fight Against the Pandemic, Does Gender Really Matter?, gotten a ton of attention, and it showed that countries run by women have done better at controlling death rates when it came to COVID-19. But why is that? So Supriya, maybe you could kick it off?
Well, there are a host of reasons. We test for one of those reasons, and that is to do with whether countries lock down quicker, whether female-led countries lock down earlier than male-led countries. And what our results find is that indeed that is the case. Female-led countries lock down around 23 to 24 deaths earlier than male-led countries did. And this must have had a cascading impact on, future transmission rates and future deaths. So that might be a contributing factor. We also find that female-led countries were not only decisive about locking down, but they also used innovative communication strategies to convey the lockdown to their citizens. So some leaders, there is sort of evidence out there to suggest that leaders have used interpersonal style of communication to, communicate this to their citizens. So Erna Solberg spoke to children directly. There's Jacinda Ardern, who uses Facebook Live to communicate with her citizens on a daily basis. So this interpersonal style of leadership might have had an impact. And that is an idea that, we are interested in sort of understanding a little further.
And why did women come to this difficult decision faster?
So we sometimes, we have thought about this a bit, and it feels as if women had a very clear objective. They wanted to save lives. Men were sort of torn between the lives and the economy, lives and livelihoods issue. So, we are very fond of saying that, the objective function of women had lives with a very high weighting and the economy with a lower weighting, whereas for men, it was something like 50-50, which also showed up in their communication. So I was saying before we started that I was reading some of the early speeches of Jacinda Ardern, and you can see she says consistently, she says, we want to go in early, we want to go in hard to save lives. The economy will come, but it will come later. And I think that there was a difference in emphasis.
Do you see that communication continuing now as we see a number of countries, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, really start to tick up in terms of COVID cases?
So it's hard to say. We've only just begun this communications work. I must say that looking at the transcripts for some of Jacinda Ardern's press interviews, it's incredibly detailed. So they literally talk about one death at a time and how this death relates to another cluster somewhere and so on. And that might relate to the fact that it has fewer cases, so actually can deal with each case in an individual manner, unlike the UK, for instance, where there are a lot more cases and it's much harder to follow them up.
And, I don't want to go into these stereotypes where I feel like people automatically do versus men and female leaders, whether you're talking about leadership of a country or an executive position, but you did do research on gender differences. And from that research, what is the leadership style? What's the difference in that style between the men you've researched in terms of the pandemic and the women? Supriya, yeah, Supriya, go for it.
Okay, so we did actually, in this paper, we haven't tested for differences in leadership style in great detail. What we do, however, is conjecture, because there is a huge amount of leadership scholarship that we can sort of lean on, if you like. And we found in that scholarship that the research on understanding gender differences among leadership style is pretty prominent. And research has found that leaders do differ by gender. So research finds that female leaders are much more empathetic, they have a leadership style that is much more democratic, much more communicative. In fact, women have to be better at communication in order to be elected as leaders, whereas this doesn't hold true for men. So even bad communicators can become leaders for men, among men. So we found that there are these, differences that have been quite systematically sort of recorded in the literature. And indeed, when we look at what's been happening on the communication front, on the decision front, we find that all these things do match up to the experience during the pandemic. So empathy went into early lockdown. Clear communication, interpersonal style of communication has also been seen. So all these things are actually, we went and saw, oh, we find this in the literature and here is evidence for it. We found this in the literature and here's the evidence for it. So it was literally, deja vu. You are finding this is what the literature is saying and we are able to corroborate it. So that was the kind of feeling that we got. And you're right that, it's not correct to stereotype, but it is also true that there are these gender differences, and perhaps it's time to celebrate these differences.
Uma, I was also looking at the fact that there's only 19 countries. Do you think that this is a big enough sample pool in terms of doing this kind of research?
Okay, so this is interesting. I mean, it's something between 18 and 20, by the way, not quite 19, because it depends on whether you want to include Guam and Puerto Rico, which are two protectorates, American protectorates or not. But anyway, either way, it's a really small sample. And this is why we ended up using this particular methodology. So this methodology is about using a pool of countries, and for each female-led country, dipping into the pool and picking up the closest match. And so in a sense, what we were trying to do was to pick up, so we picked up the closest match, the second, third, and fifth, and 5 closest matches. And each time you just dip into the pool. So the whole range of countries only enters as matches for the female-led countries. So in that sense, there's no averaging out of the effect. And so that's quite useful when you're trying to use this kind of a methodology with quite a small number, quite a small sample.
For these women, as we enter the winter months and we don't have a vaccine yet, do you think their strategies will hold in place even though they have seen potentially economic damages?
So
Yeah,
sorry.
go for it. No, go for it. Go for it. Go for it.
So I think one of the issues for both sets of leaders is that lockdown just offered them an opportunity, right? It was an opportunity that which they had to use to get the rest of the, not just the economy, but their infrastructure in gear for the winter. That's really what lockdown offered. It was never going to be the final instrument that they were going to use. So the really crucial thing is two. One, whether the women leaders as well as the men leaders have actually put in the effort into trying to create conditions. So test and trace, using other instruments to be able to hold infections and death rates down. And the second is what's happening to the economy. Now, as far as we can make out, the ones who closed down early also emerged from lockdown earlier. So the impact on the economy would be a lot less in those countries than in countries that went in later, because of course they had more deaths, which meant that they had to lock down for much longer.
Yeah, do you want to add on that, Supriya?
Absolutely. I mean, I'd agree with everything that Uma says. We are finding that, for instance, Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand was the first country to open up its economy fully, except for people coming from abroad. And Germany opened up the competitive sports. So we are finding that actually early, when we started this research, we thought female leaders are taking a big risk with locking down their economies early, but now we are beginning to find that actually it's turned out counterintuitive. So by locking down their economies early, by seemingly taking risk with their economies early on, they've actually probably done their economies a favor. And it remains, you spoke about, will this communication strategy hold up? I mean, obviously, we need to do deeper research into this, but even just looking at the kind of messaging that we find in the UK, it's all over the place. I mean, every day we have a moving goalpost. We do not know from day to day what the policy is going to be. It seems that we are meant to wear masks, but there are several exceptions. It seems that, schools, it seems like people can only meet in groups of 6, but then again, there are several exceptions. So, there are so much mixed messaging going on. Nobody really knows what the policy on that current day is. So there are these experiences which seem to tell us that perhaps ultimately it will be clear-cut communication strategies. And as Uma said, how have leaders spent that time that they got during the lockdown? Did they spend that wisely to make sure that they had a test and trace strategy that would work? That is going to be telling in the medium to long term, and that remains to be tested.
So as we go into these winter months and we're already starting to see these upticks, you're already seeing the communication part of their strategy work. What other data points are you looking out for almost in like this second part of the pandemic for this year as we wait for this vaccine?
I think one of the big things that we should be looking for, and we haven't started at all, by the way, so this isn't work we are doing already, but I think we will need to begin to look at how much test and trace is happening. So I read recently that, for instance, the UK, surprise, surprise, I'm sure Supriya will be surprised by this, is a big shot as far as testing is concerned. I'm amazed. Apparently, the UK tests 2.5 people for every 1,000, which is higher than Germany and higher than, I don't know, another European country. But the point is that if leaders had used that time usefully, they would be in a much better position to test now, also to trace. And so I think one of the things that we should be looking at is the test and trace issue. The second is how hospitals are coping, because I think come the winter months, usually in most countries, hospitals find it very difficult to cope with the winter flu. And so now they're going to have the pandemic over and above that. So the ability of hospitals to cope, and therefore in the end, of course, deaths. I think cases is going to become less crucial than deaths, or at least, or maybe critical cases. The cases that actually end up in hospital is really what we should be looking at. Because just to add, because if there is any element of herd immunity, then actually cases probably is not a really important.
Right, because you have it, you stay home for 2 weeks, you have a bit of a flu, but there's some people where it affects obviously much worse. That makes sense. Just one quick final question. If you had to rate countries, top 3, both of you, what would be your ratings of who did the best job?
New Zealand. I think it's hands down, isn't it? I mean, she has to be given the prize.
I think certainly New Zealand. I think Germany is a big country, and to have
population-wise, yeah.
I think Angela Merkel has done a fantastic job to have managed it. And you can see, this is something Supriya likes to say, you can see that the cases are a lot in Germany, but deaths are not. That matters. They tested much earlier than most of Europe. I think Germany's done a pretty sterling job.